Any thoughts or issues or problems? And those are all good. You've got your mind going, brother. I hear you over there. Do you have anything you want to add, or you want to wait till later? Or?
Yeah, no. I'm enjoying the ride.
Coolness. Very cool, very cool. Anyone else? Yes?
I would just
Evelyn.
like to say, if I was working 8 hours, now this is true, and someone came for 1 hour and got the same pay, I'd have a problem with that. I'm sorry. That just
American.
I vote for what that part is.
Right on. That's American, baby. That's what are you doing? Right. That's work for us. I want to make that. Yeah, I pay. Tom's got some very interesting. They're very interesting modern day American parallels. He was sharing with me. Yeah. All right. So let's go back to the beginning. Since there's not much from Western history that we can discover that's really going to help bring to light this parable. Right? Because I just showed you the two main strands, and they're not too good. First off, we have to ask about the likely form of this story as the prepaschal Jesus originally told it. In the Matthean version of this story, is this version likely the version of the story that came directly from Jesus?
No, highly unlikely.
Highly unlikely. So recall that with our exploration of the parable of the tenants, we saw that the version found in the early pre-Gnostic Sayings Gospel of Thomas, probably that version was closer to Jesus' original than that found in the Gospel of Mark, which had become an allegory. Unfortunately, we do not have another version of the parable of the day laborers in the vineyard with which to compare and contrast it to. But you know what? We can still go to work. Virtually every New Testament scholar agrees that in their original forms, Jesus' parables lacked all introductions and conclusions. You can rest assured that all the introductions and conclusions attached to the parables you and I read in the Gospels are secondary or tertiary literary contexts and inventions of the Gospel writers themselves, stage 3. When Jesus told these parables in their original forms, stage 1, none of these introductions or conclusions existed. Why do scholars conclude that the original parables lacked intros and conclusions? Consider for a moment the parable of the great banquet, which is found in Matthew chapter 22, Luke chapter 14, and Sayings Gospel of Thomas, pre-Gnostic form, Logion 64. This is a story about a guy who goes out and invites a bunch of respectable people who wind up skipping the party, and so he invites a bunch of dishonorable, shameful types. When you read this parable in the gospel called Matthew, chapter 22, 1-14, you find this introduction. Once more, Jesus spoke to them in parables. Note the two words, once more. When you carefully explore Matthew, you realize that what the author has done is put together a big collection of Jesus' parables. Then he introduces them. Jesus said, ... parable. And then he stacks these parables, one right after the other, with intros. He said, ... and a parable. And then he said, ... and a parable, or another parable, couple parables. And then once more, Jesus spoke to them in parables, ... and gives more parables. But in the other Gospels, that same list of parables is scattered all throughout the story in ways very different, in a completely different narrative arrangement than the one found in Matthew. What does that tell you? That tells you that Matthew and Mark and Luke are looking at this pile of, they have access to a pile of parables. We'll call it the pile of parables. And they're just grabbing these parables parables and dropping them into their narrative different ways. I'll put this one when Jesus is in Capernaum. I'll put this one where Jesus is in the temple. I'll put this one over here. Okay? The context depends, it acquires a new context, which becomes the narrative of the particular gospel we're reading. What was the original context? There is no original. We don't have it. We also find the kingdom of Skyvault may be compared to in Matthew. That phrase, the kingdom of Skyvault, appears in no other New Testament writing other than Matthew. Matthew uses this phrase to introduce a large share of the parables. But only Matthew does this. And when we find a parable that is in Matthew and also in Mark and in Luke, and the intro, the kingdom of Skyvault may be compared to, does not appear in the Markan version and does not appear in the Lucan version of the same story, the same parable, then it's very easy for you, isn't it, to arrive at the idea that this phrase, the kingdom of Skyvault, is a Matthewism, unique to Matthew. Stage 3, Matthew. And doesn't come from stage 1. Think about this because it does something rather extraordinary to your reading. If we stick the introductory phrase onto the parable of the great banquet so that it begins, the kingdom of Skyvault, theocracy, God, may be compared to a king, can you see how quickly that king becomes an analog for God? So that it is God who's throwing the great banquet? God is king, right? But if the introductory phrase wasn't originally on the prepaschal Jesus' lips when he told the original story of the great banquet, maybe we're not talking about God when we talk about the wealthy man who throws the banquet. Maybe we're talking about a greedy son of a bitch who's foreclosed on peasants' lands. What do you think?
Possible.
And in fact, when you examine some of the parables that Matthew has stuck the kingdom of Skyvault may be compared to, and you then look over at the same parable found on the other Gospels where that intro phrase is missing, it becomes crystal clear that the character in the story cannot be an analog for the God of Israel. Here's another punchline. For many are called, but few are chosen. The Calvinists love this one. Some people who like to think of God as Jehovah the Hutt also like this one. You know, Jehovah the Hutt from Star Wars. Matthew also attaches a concluding punchline onto the parable of the great banquet. For many are called, but few are chosen. Know for sure, folks, that Jesus, prepaschal Jesus, never concluded his original parable with that. Stage 1. How can we know for sure? For many are called, but few are chosen is just another example of an all-purpose punchline taken from the stock repertoire of Matthew. The author of Matthew sure likes that one. He likes to stick it onto a whole bunch of things. He sticks it on the end of different parables. It's one of his favorites. For many are called, few are chosen. It also appears elsewhere in the other synoptic gospels, but curiously not on their version of this story. What does that tell you? You got multiple versions of the same story. Some stories have, one of them has, for many are called, few are chosen. The other two versions don't have that as the ending. Then you think, when Jesus told this story, could he have put that on the end? No. No. It's just a common preacher all-purpose punchline, folks. Preachers do that all the time. In Matthew, the parable of the great banquet is a wedding feast. But in Luke, this same story is no wedding banquet. Jesus is having dinner at the house of a rich guy. Now, having dinner at the house of a rich guy and a wedding banquet, those are two very different contexts, aren't they? That changes it, right? In the Lucan form, the dinner guests are conversing, and one of the guests says, "Blessed is anyone who will eat bread in the kingdom." What follows this is, quote, "And then Jesus said to him," and what follows is the Lucan version of the parable of the great banquet. That's a wholly different introduction than you get in Matthew. It's the same story, but it's recontextualized with a different intro. If you look next at the conclusion of the parable of the great banquet in Luke, it is this, quote, "I tell you, none of these invited will taste my dinner." That's very different than the Matthean conclusion, which is, "For many are called, few are chosen." Wait a minute, what's the meaning of the story? Is it, "I tell you, none of those invited will taste my dinner"? Or is it, "For many are called, but few are chosen"? Now, the parable of the great banquet also happens to appear found in the Sayings Gospel of Thomas. The only intro we get there is Jesus said. That's how the Gospel of Thomas is. Jesus said, da-da-da-da. Jesus said, da-da-da-da. Jesus said. That's it. No more context. It's not a dinner at a rich guy's house. It's not a wedding either. It's just Jesus said, and then the story comes out. But the Sayings Gospel of Thomas does give you a punchline for this parable. And it is this, quote, "Buyers and merchants will not enter the places of my Father." Wow. This is a guy who doesn't like merchants. That's a completely different punchline than "For many are called, but few are chosen" in Matthew. And "I tell you, none of those invited will taste my dinner" in Luke. It's this kind of internal evidence, folks, that shows to scholars that the intros and concluding punchlines that you find in the gospel parables are the inventions of the writers of the Gospels, stage 3, and did not originate with the prepaschal Jesus, stage 1. While we have only explored one example of this with the parable of the great banquet, we could see this same thing in many other variant parables. Whenever a given homilist or preacher gets a hold of a story, they imagine this is the point of the story, one way. And by the time you get a hold of the story, you think, no, this is the point of the story. And the result of this is your punchline differs from the preacher's punchline. Gospel of Matthew. The punchline is, to Matthew, many are called, but few are chosen. Gospel of Luke. The parable, no, none of those invited will taste my dinner. Gospel of Thomas. Buyers and merchants will not enter the places of my Father. This is just the messy way human beings work, folks. We like to think everything is uniform and perfectly one. That's not how it is with truth, folks. More like a diamond and the light. So, Gospel of Matthew, parable of the day laborers of the vineyard. The intro, the kingdom of Skyvault is like. The conclusion, the last shall be first and the first shall be last. So this leads us to the next step of getting to the roots of the parable, this parable we're looking at in this presentation. We're going to have to remove, aren't we, the introduction and the concluding punchline, because those were created stage 3 by Matthew. I don't want to remove them from our Bibles or our lectionary, mind you, but we have to remove them here in Bible Alive for now if we're going to try to get at what this parable originally was in the mouth of Jesus, because those two phrases were not there. If we remove the introduction, the kingdom of Skyvault is like, we have subtracted one of the favorite phrases of Matthew. Doing that, we have also dropped the notion that the vineyard owner is an analog for God, right?
Right.
If the peasant artisan turned folk healer Jesus got up and told his peasant audience, I want to tell you a story about a vineyard owner, would any of his peasant listeners have taken from that he was about to hear a story about somebody who was like God? We also have to take off the ending because it's a punchline cooked up by a later preacher. The last will be first and the first will be last is a free-floating saying Matthew has decided to drop in whenever he needs it. It's found in completely different stories in Mark 10 and Luke 13. Matthew uses the last will be first, the first will be last several times. It was a favorite punchline of his. Those ain't bad ideas. The first will be last, the last will be first. It just does not belong here. So let's drop it. Eliminate it.